Hello, oceanography students. Today we're going to learn about the San Francisco Bay estuary. So, the estuary was discovered by Europeans in 1769. Obviously, were already people living in the area, but in 1769, some Spanish soldiers were looking for the harbor at Monterey Bay, and obviously they were lost. But after climbing over hills, they ended up seeing the estuary, and they described it as the most grand estuary or arm of the sea. They described seeing an ecosystem that was brimming with life, with whales and sea otters, and they could see huge salmon when they explored, and sturgeon, and all kinds of different birds, um, and all kinds of stuff. So let's learn a little bit about what the San Francisco Bay estuary is, starting with a reminder of what an estuary is. So estuary is defined as a semi-enclosed body of water. Semi-enclosed meaning that it's surrounded by land. And semi-enclosed, it's varying degrees, right? Monterey Bay is also considered an estuary, but it's pretty open to Pacific Ocean, whereas San Francisco Bay is an estuary, and it's very much, has a very small opening to the ocean. So it's a semi-enclosed body of water where you have freshwater input meeting saltwater input or from the ocean. Okay, so you have rivers and you have ocean water that are meeting. SF Bay is the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas, and it covers about 1,600 square miles. So 1,153 square miles of that are called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and 488 square miles of that is the actual San Francisco Bay, which is the watery environment. And San Francisco Bay actually drains about 40% of the water of California. So 2 times per day, 1,300,000 acre feet of salt water moves into the bay on a high tide and moves back out of the bay on a low tide. So this movement of water is called the tidal prism, and it makes up about a quarter of the estuary's volume. So 2 times a day, a quarter of the estuary's volume is essentially coming in and leaving. So that's quite a bit. And just to give you an idea of what an acre foot is, will basically cover an entire acre. The water will cover an entire acre up to 1 foot depth. So it's equal to about 326,000 gallons of water, and an acre is about 2/3 of the length of a football field, to give you an idea. Okay. In contrast to that tidal prism, the average daily flow of fresh water into the estuary coming from rivers is only about 50,000 acre feet. Okay, so there's definitely more salt water that's coming in and going out than there is fresh water coming in on a consistent basis. Okay, so the average daily flow of fresh water is about 50,000 acre feet. Okay, so here is the estuary. Well, this is watery. Here's the delta here, and here's the bay. So the Pacific Ocean comes in, and it brings with it salt water. So again, that's the tidal prism coming in. And where the salt water and the fresh water are mixing can change. It can move tens of miles upstream or downstream, depending on how much river flow there is and the height of the tide. So a good low tide uncovers about 1/6 of the bay's total area, with the largest amount of exposed mudflats extending across the eastern and the southern parts of the South Bay and the northern parts of the San Pablo and the Sassoon Bays. Okay, so we're basically exposing a lot of area for shorebirds to come and feed. But there are conditions where you have extreme low amounts of fresh water that are coming in, which would actually allow for the salt water to intrude farther up the estuary, or you have lots of fresh water that's coming in that actually keeps the salt water out. For example, the Great Flood of 1862, which actually temporarily turned the Central Valley of California and much of the bay into basically freshwater lakes because there was so much water. It actually pushed the mixing zone between the saltwater and freshwater beyond the Golden Gate Bridge out into the Pacific Ocean, about 40 miles from shore. So 40 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge out into the Pacific Ocean could be fresh water on the surface of the water there. So essentially all of San Francisco Bay would have been fresh water at that time. In contrast, the opposite extreme came in the fall of about 1931 when they had an extremely dry summer, and that allowed for less fresh water come in, and the salt water actually went all the way to about Stockton. So the salt water actually intruded all the way in the Sacramento River. And all the way up to Sacramento, and then all the way on the San Joaquin River to Stockton. So that's quite a ways where you could normally would be fresh water, and it was actually salt water there. So the tide very much depends on how much fresh water is coming in and how much salt water is coming in. Okay, so we'll start out with one part of the estuary, which is the delta. The delta is the most upstream area. So we can see in this map right here, so here we are, California, here's San Francisco Bay. Okay, the delta is this area right here, which I have zoomed in on here. Okay, so here's the delta. This is basically kind of marshland, typically. So it once gathered waters from the Sacramento, the San Joaquin, the McKelvey, and the Cosumnes rivers, and sent that water to the San Francisco Bay. However, now it's turned into a plumbing system, essentially, because we are taking that water and sending it away to farmers and to households as drinking water and bathing water and all of that stuff. So where it used to be extensive tule marshes, which are shown in this image here, it's now been diked and basically keeping the salt water from intruding, and that diked land has been turned into farmland. So we have levees and dikes that are keeping the salt water out and basically keeping all of the water out, and that's being used as farmlands now. So San Francisco Bay and the Delta have been changed drastically over the course of their discovery by Europeans. So San Francisco Bay is then the downstream of the rivers. This is all the watery part. This is all the bay. Okay, and it's separated into 4 smaller bays or basins. So we have the uppermost part here. We have the Sassoon Bay and the marsh that's surrounding the Sassoon Bay. Basically, this Sassoon Marsh also has wetlands that have been diked, so again, being used as farmland around there and for other land purposes as well. And it's going to be the least salty because it's closest to the freshwater input. Then you have San Pablo Bay right here. Then we go to the Central Bay right here, which connects to the Pacific Ocean. And then finally we go to the South Bay, which is the southern lobe of the bay and extends up to the Central Bay here. Okay, so let's review that again. This map is labeled with all of the different parts of the San Francisco Bay estuary, as well as the Pacific Ocean. So let's test your knowledge of what I just went over. So A, what would that be? You should say the delta. What's B? You should say Sassoon Bay. What about C? That's called San Pablo Bay. And D? That's the Central Bay. And E is the South Bay. And what about F? Hopefully you get this right. Pacific Ocean. Okay, so these little blue lines right here, those are bridges. Okay, and for reference, sometimes it's easier for students to be able to actually see a map of the area that has roads on it. That might be helpful to you. So I can zoom in here. Let's see. I think I can zoom in here. Okay, so here would be the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Here's San Pablo Bay. So San Pablo Bay, this is the Richmond Bridge right here. Okay, here's the Carquinez Bridge over here, and here is the Benicia Bridge over here. Let's go back to that original image. We go into San Pablo Bay. See if we can go, no, we didn't go far enough. So San Pablo Bay would be over here, and this is the Benicia Bridge, and here's the Carquinez Bridge. This is called the Carquinez Strait going through here. And then as we go right here, this is the Central Bay. So here's the Richmond Bridge here. Here is the Bay Bridge. Here's the Golden Gate Bridge. And then here you have the South Bay over here. So this is 101, and this is 80 right here. Here we are in Pleasant Hill. So just to give you a reference of all the different locations, and then the delta would be over this way. Okay, so now let's talk about where the freshwater and the saltwater input comes from. So the average daily flow of freshwater is, again, about 50,000 acre feet, and it mainly comes from the Sacramento, the San Joaquin, the McCallum, and the Casumnes rivers. But of course, you could also get freshwater input if you have a very heavy rain. We also get smaller amounts of freshwater input from the Petaluma and the Napa rivers, as well as from some small sloughs and creeks as well. Obviously, the amount of freshwater that's coming in is going to depend on rain, and it's also going to depend on the snow, because basically, if you have a lot of snow, the snow will melt, and that melted liquid will move through the rivers and eventually make its way to San Francisco Bay. About half of California's surface water supply falls into San Francisco Bay watershed. So the watershed covers about 60,000 square miles. We have diked or put dams in to decrease the amount of freshwater that's actually going into San Francisco Bay. Well, the purpose was not to decrease the freshwater going to San Francisco Bay. It was to use freshwater for households and farms, and also to make more land for farms. So this basically occurred between 1860 and 1930. And you might think about, maybe historically speaking, what was happening around the Bay Area during that time. Basically, there was a huge influx of people, because it started with the gold rush and it just continued on. And so with the huge influx of people, they needed to provide more resources, which included fresh water and food. So that's what happened there. So that reduced the tidal area from over 500 square miles to about 90 square miles. So that is a huge decrease in change in the estuary. We have dams that support about 10 reservoirs around the Bay Area. We have 3 dams on the Sacramento River that were built between 1945 and 1969. We have 4 dams on the San Joaquin River that were built between 1926 and 1960. We have 3 dams on the McCallum River, which were built between 1929 and 1963. So why do we have dams? Well, we have 7.5 million residents that need to be supported by our drinking water that would normally go into San Francisco Bay. So half of the surface water supply is diverted for drinking water to about 25 million people and about 4.5 million acres of agricultural land. Okay, so essentially what the dams do is they keep the water from flowing, or they control how much water is flowing out of them. So this image is showing us where that fresh water ends up going. So we have the blue line right here, which is showing the California aqueduct. So you can see that water is actually being diverted from what would go into San Francisco Bay, and it's being taken all the way down to Southern California. Okay, we get drinking water in Pleasant Hill. Our drinking water actually comes from San Francisco Bay. The drinking water in San Francisco actually comes from the Hetch Hetchy Reserve or reservoir over near Yosemite. The North Bay, they have their own drinking water. It comes from reservoirs up there. But a lot of our fresh water is actually being diverted down to Southern California. Southern California also gets drinking water from the Colorado River, and also from water along the eastern Sierras as well. So, you know, that shouldn't be surprising, because Southern California is more desert-like, and so they don't have a lot of fresh water, and they have a huge population of people. So there's been a continuous fight over the water in San Francisco Bay and what it should go to and what it should be used for. Okay, so the tidal range is basically where the salt goes. So we have the tide going, coming into the bay and moving into the northern reaches and in the southern reaches. So the tidal range is very different between the northern and the southern reaches. In the north, the tidal range drops with increasing distance from the ocean. On average, at the Golden Gate Bridge, it is 5.5 feet, but it's only about 3 feet in Sacramento. In the south, the range is about 8.5 feet. Okay, so again, that's the difference between the high tide and the low tide. So the land changes 8.5 feet from where it was underwater to where it was above water. And I need to go back because I realized that I forgot to tell you about water depths in the San Francisco Bay. So below the Golden Gate Bridge, it's the deepest. It's about 360 feet. But the average depth of San Francisco Bay is only about 43 feet. However, there are ranges here. So between Angel Island and Alcatraz, it actually gets down to about 100 feet deep, and the upper and the northern parts are only about 16 feet deep. So obviously there's some fluctuations there. Okay, so based on the tide and some environmental conditions, we have changes in how salty different parts of the bay is. All right, so San Francisco Bay is considered a slightly stratified estuary, which means that if you go from the surface down, you do see a gradual increase in the salinity of the water, or the saltiness of the water. So we get most fresh water in the northern reaches, obviously, because that's where the rivers are coming out. It's going to be most strongly stratified in the winter and the wetter years, where you have a greater increase of freshwater input. So when you go all the way to the north to like Sassoon Bay, you might only have a salinity of 1 part per thousand. So it might be like nearly freshwater. But then when you go to the mouth of the bay, the salinity could be about 30 parts per thousand. Okay, so we see a very huge range of salinities. And we kind of talked about this in lab in saying that, the organisms that live in the upper reaches of the bay are going to be more suited for freshwater conditions, whereas as you go closer to the mouth of the bay to the Pacific Ocean, you're going to see more organisms that are suited to higher salinities and more ocean water conditions. The southern reach, the southern arm of San Francisco Bay, or the South Bay, only gets 1/10 of the amount of freshwater as the north. So instead of getting freshwater input, they're mostly getting saltwater input. So therefore it tends to not be as stratified because it doesn't have the fresh water on the surface and the salt water on the bottom. Instead, it just has salt water, and it doesn't have a lot of circulation either. And in the summertime, it's very hot in the South Bay. So we actually have salt water with a lot of evaporation, which makes the water sometimes even saltier than the actual ocean water is. And so that's why they have a lot of salt ponds, or used to at least have a lot of salt ponds in the South Bay. Okay, so again, we have river flow that's coming in around the delta. So we're going to have the freshest water up here. So Sassoon Bay is going to be the freshest out of all of them. And then we have San Pablo Bay. Central Bay is going to be probably most similar with the Pacific Ocean, and the South Bay is most likely the saltiest of all of them. Okay, so San Francisco Bay is also biologically important. So it supports at least 750 different species of plants and animals. There are over 1 million migratory birds that come into San Francisco Bay. So that's half of the Pacific Coast water birds migrate through this area. It's a nursery ground for juvenile fish and crabs. And when I say nursery ground, I mean that they come in and they lay their eggs, and their young grow up here, and then they leave the bay once they're bigger and older. 2/3 of Californian salmon actually pass through San Francisco Bay, and we also have a commercial Pacific herring fishery here as well. But there are also some ecological troubles in San Francisco Bay. For example, we've lost a lot of the wetlands that we have. Basically, it's been diked and turned into farmland. We also have a high amount of dredging. So On average, over 7 million cubic yards of sediment are dredged from the estuary each year. So the reason why dredging occurs, of course, is because we have a lot of shipping ports. So in order for those ships to get through the generally shallow water, they need to dredge the water and make it deeper. Okay, and there are a number of reasons why that might be harmful ecologically. One, you're digging up the bottom, and so all those organisms that live in the bottom, which we term benthic organisms, are basically being picked up and having their homes moved. Additionally, there are a lot of pollutants that settle into the sediment, and so when dredging occurs, you're actually taking those sediments, those pollutants, and putting them back into the water. So those are just two reasons why dredging is not very good ecologically. There's a lot of pollution, which I'll get to in a minute. We've talked about dams and diversions, which means that there's less fresh water coming in. So if there's less fresh water coming in, then that is going to have a great effect on those organisms that are suited for fresher water. And you guys are going to read an article about one of those for an assignment this week. And unfortunately, we also have a huge number of non-native species that are in San Francisco Bay as well. Okay, so loss of vegetated wetlands. So essentially, we've seen the destruction of about 27 freshwater and seasonally flooded marshes in the Delta, which has caused the eradication of the number of birds, shorebirds, rails, herons, terns, for example. The habitat has declined greatly, which of course is, going to affect birds, but it's also going to affect the fish and lots of other organisms, including native clams. And the amount of marshlands have declined so drastically, which is shown in this image here. So the blue is water. The gray is the tidal marsh before 1850. So you can think of that gray area as being habitat for lots of organisms that were native to San Francisco Bay. So that's before 1850. The black is what remains today. So it's only a fraction of what it used to be. What used to be here, we used to actually have grizzly bears. We used to have elk. Those have all left. Whales and sea otters were actually common in San Francisco Bay, which are not as common, but recently we've actually had some whales come into the bay as well. And basically now we have invasive species that are outnumbering the native species due to all of the changes that we've made. There's also a lot of pollution in San Francisco Bay. So one, we have sewer waste, which was due to a huge, increased population of people that live around San Francisco Bay. The gold rush brought in mercury. So mercury is used in the mining process to basically extract the gold from the ore. And so the mercury that was used ended up running down the Sacramento River and ending up in San Francisco Bay and accumulating. So that mercury is still there. It's basically accumulates in the sediment, and every time they dredge, it gets brought back into the water, where it gets incorporated into the fish that live there. And so it's fish in San Francisco Bay are not very good for you to eat due to this. We also have oil spills due to the shipping industry, which oil spills, we've had huge oil spills, but then there's also the ones that are just kind of constant oil leaking. When you have boats that are constantly moving through the bay, they're kind of constantly leaking small amounts of oil. Of course, there's farmland around San Francisco Bay. With all that diking, the land's been changed to farmland. So there's fertilizers that are being put into the water. And we talked a little bit about why fertilizers might be bad for a waterway. Remember, that ends up being increased nutrients in the water by way of runoff. Basically, farmers put fertilizers on their crops. It rains, and that fertilizer gets brought into the water. And so then you have these basically algae blooms that end up causing low oxygen conditions when they die and their bodies are decomposed by the bacteria. The bacteria use up the oxygen. Um, Also, lots of farms use pesticides, right? So pesticide essentially means like killing pests. And so some of those pesticides might be targeted at rodents, which could then also, affect other native mammals that are in the area. They also have pesticides that are specifically for insects, which could then be harmful to shrimp and amphipods and things like that, and copepods. So, farming can be have a really big ecological effect on San Francisco Bay. And then, of course, because we have urban environments, San Francisco, Oakland, all around San Francisco Bay, we have runoff that comes from, cars leaking and other industrial processes, which carry heavy metals and PHs, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and PCBs, which are pollinated, chlorinated by phenols, and then, of course, pesticides as well from other processes other than farming. So this is showing you essentially how much is being put into San Francisco Bay of these different toxins. Okay, so there are a lot of pollutants that are being put into the bay. The amount is shown in here as the pool. So we have all kinds of things that are, endocrine disruptors. They are things that can affect immune systems. There are things that can affect reproductive systems as well. And this chart here is something that is put out for those people who tend to fish in San Francisco Bay. So the green are organisms that live in the bay that are safe to eat 2 servings per week if you are a woman 18 to 45 or you are a child 1 to 17. Or, if you start feeding your child earlier than that, 6 months to 17, right? This is due to that mercury load into the pollutants that are in the water. Certain fish tend to accumulate those more than others due to basically what they eat. So it says that salmon and brown rockfish and red rock crab and jack smelt are okay to eat 2 servings per week that are caught in San Francisco Bay. You can eat 1 serving of California halibut or white croaker that's caught in the bay, and you should never eat striped bass or purchase sharks or white sturgeon that's caught in the bay. Now, the reason why this doesn't say men, it says women 18 to 45, that's because they're targeting women that are reproductive age, because if they are pregnant and they're eating these toxins, that can greatly harm the fetus. So the reason why these organisms are on the list are because they tend to accumulate a higher load. White sturgeon and sharks, for example, they're higher on the food chain, and therefore they eat a lot of organisms that accumulate toxins in their tissue, and therefore the sharks and the white sturgeons end up accumulating a lot of them. We also have about 250 non-native species in the bay. Some of them have been introduced intentionally as food, like certain types of fish. They maybe have been introduced accidentally as well, and there are a lot of them that are introduced accidentally. We've kind of talked about this a little bit already. So non-native species are species that come in and they are not native to the area. Now, we use the term invasive species to refer to species that come in and they compete for resources, and they are negatively impacting the diversity of the native community, meaning that they are either eating the native community or they are competing with resources or out-competing the native species. An example of this is the Atlantic mud snail, which displaced the native horned snail. Okay, so we have an invasive species called the Atlantic mud snail that came in, and now we have a major decline in the native horned snail. And here I found this funny picture of the Atlantic mud snail. Additionally, we've already learned about this one, the Potamacorbula clam. It came in and it eats lots of phytoplankton, and so it's basically outcompeted other types of clams for food. Sometimes the non-native species actually eat native species, and that's why they're termed invasive species, because they're declining the native species population just because they're eating them. For example, striped bass and black bass, have eaten the thick-tailed chub and the Sacramento perch and basically decimated their populations. And the exotic red foxes and the Norway rats have targeted the eggs or the chicks of the clapper rails, which are native to the San Francisco Bay. Clapper rails are a type of bird. And so these introduced species are eating native species and causing their decline. Now, we have in lab talked a little bit about how they get here. One thing that we kind of talked about is that they come in ballast water, they come in the shipping industry. So that's a really common way for these invasive species to come in. Essentially, they're coming in because they were attached to a boat and produced eggs, and those eggs hatched in our waters, or maybe they were already in the ballast water, and the ballast water was released in San Francisco Bay, and it essentially released all of the larvae of organisms that came from other places. And have basically decided that San Francisco Bay is a good place for them to live, and they've thrived here, unfortunately. Okay, so that's it for the San Francisco Bay lecture. If you have any questions, please post them under the weekly discussions. Thank you.